Channel 375. And we're video and audio podcasting at democracynow.org. Our headlines are also available in Spanish for any radio station to take around the world, as over 180 are. Our transcripts are in Spanish there as well. Well, earlier this week, the Supreme Court upheld an Indiana law requiring voters to show photo identification. In a 6-3 ruling, the court agreed with Republican supporters that the voter ID law was necessary to prevent voter fraud and safeguard public confidence in the integrity of elections. Many Democrats and civil rights groups have opposed the law, saying it's a thinly veiled effort to suppress elderly, poor, and minority voters, those most likely to lack proper ID and who tend to vote for Democrats. Voter ID laws are one of many contentious issues facing the American electorate ahead of the November presidential election. Today, we're joined by the top election officials in 2 states. Here in California, Debra Bowen is Secretary of State. Robin Carnahan is Secretary of State in Missouri. They both join me here in the San Diego PBS station, KPBS. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Let's begin with you, Debra Bowen. The Indiana law, the Supreme Court decision, the significance of it.
Well, it is limited to Indiana. So right now, we only have 7 states that have similar laws, but I think we're all watching to see what happens in other states. It wasn't a good case. We didn't have facts showing what would actually happen, and I think Secretary Carnahan has really been following this closely. And
Secretary Carnahan, your response?
Well, you know, we have had this same issue in Missouri a couple of years ago about whether it was appropriate to have a state-issued photo ID. You know, I think for all of us in the elections business, it makes sense that people identify themselves when they go to vote. The question is, what kind of document is needed to do that? In my state, you have several choices about that. The legislature tried to make it one specific kind of ID card that not everybody had. And so that's the real problem. We want to make sure that every eligible citizen is able to vote and make sure that folks who shouldn't vote aren't voting. And you have to have some kind of ID. The question is reasonableness, and that's what the Supreme Court was getting at.
What was the motivation behind the attempt in Missouri?
Well, I don't know exactly what was in the hearts of the people who wanted to do this. What they said publicly, pardon me, was that it was about preventing voter fraud. The problem is, in my state and many others, there's not a lot of evidence of in-person voter fraud, meaning someone shows up at the polls and pretends that they're somebody else. For me, elections are really important, but for most people, that's not important enough to go lie about.
What does it mean to have this kind of identification, and why is that so onerous, and why does it particularly affect certain populations?
Well, what we've seen is that many times it's not the ID itself. If you could go get one, it would be no big deal, but you require lots of underlying documents in order to get the ID in the first place. In Missouri, it was required that you would bring forward a birth certificate, a Social Security card. If your name had changed, you had to have the legal documents for that, as well as proof of residence. So it could be sort of a burden, particularly if you maybe were born out of state and tried to get a birth certificate to replace one that you didn't have. And if you couldn't do that, you wouldn't be able to get an ID card that would let you then vote.
And poorer people and older people.
You know, you can think about who doesn't have a driver's license, right? And that's what we did in Missouri, is we took a look at the driver's license and non-driver's license list and the voter list and compared those and found that over 200,000 people could have been harmed by this. They were registered voters but didn't have this particular required state ID card.
How many?
Over 200,000.
Do you think, as a result of the Supreme Court decision, there will be a proliferation of these attempts to require this kind of ID in different states?
I think the debate will certainly be opened up by this, but as Secretary Bowen mentioned, the case in the Supreme Court was very specific. It was about Indiana law and Indiana facts. And we had a case in Missouri that our state Supreme Court found unconstitutional because they showed and understood that people were really harmed by this. So I think what we need to do is just tell the story about not everyone having this specific ID, and let's do things that are more reasonable and inclusive that ensures that people are able to vote.
We're joined by two Secretaries of State, the Secretary of State of California, Debra Bowen, and the Secretary of State of Missouri, Carnahan. We'll be back with them in a minute. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're on the road in San Diego. We're joined by two Secretaries of State, by Debra Bowen, Secretary of State of California, Carnahan, Secretary of State of Missouri. The issue of electronic voting machines. Secretary Bowen, you just received the 2008 JFK Profile and Courage Award. You took on the electronic voting machine industry here in the state. Talk about the review you did of electronic voting machines.
Well, we didn't just review electronic voting machines. I reviewed all voting systems. This is the review.
We're looking at many inches thick review here.
It is. It was commissioned by the University of California. We had a series of independent experts from universities and the private sector around the country. They looked at security. They looked at accessibility. And this equipment is intended to allow disabled voters to vote. And we found things like the legs on the voting machine are so close together that anyone in a wheelchair can't get under it. And we looked at the documentation and we reviewed the source code. One of the big issues, of course, is that this source code is private. It's a trade secret. And in California, at least, the local registrars, local elections officials, are not allowed to look at it. And everyone in my office who looked at it had to sign non-disclosure agreements. So there's a lot that's public, but much that we discovered that I could not make public. And this is really an issue for voting systems in this country, that we have systems in which ordinary citizens are not allowed to view the mechanisms by which their votes are recorded. It should give people a great deal of pause.
So what did you do?
I decertified all of the touchscreen voting systems with the exception of one per precinct, because it is, in many instances, the best we can do for voters who have physical disabilities. And we've moved to a paper-based system, a Scantron or optical scan. Most Americans are familiar with it. It's a typical multiple-choice format. That gives us the individual voter's record of how they intended to mark their ballot. And I coupled that with an increase in the auditing standards, because if you have the voter's ballot, but you don't know when you have to go back to look at that record, you haven't really improved the situation. So we now in California, if we have a race that's within 0.5% at that first count, we will automatically expand the recount and do a 10% hand count in that race until we are able to basically have 99.99% certainty that we've called the race accurately.
What about electronic voting machines in Missouri, Secretary Carnahan?
We're basically a paper-based system in Missouri. We also have, as is federally required, at least one of the touchscreen machines in every polling place, and those all have what they're called voter-verified paper audit trails, so that there's a piece of paper that's printed out at the time the voter is casting their vote. And I'm also trying this year to have our legislature pass a bill to make sure everybody has a choice to vote on a paper ballot so that there's no risk of running out on Election Day.
Why is this issue of having a receipt, a record of your vote, so difficult here in this country? Rush Holt, the congressman from New Jersey, has been trying to push this through for years. We can get it when we go to the ATM. We get receipts when we go grocery shopping. Why is this so difficult when it comes to voting machines, Secretary Bowen?
The receipt is, we need to get past the paper record because I don't think it actually works.